2, 3, 4. In this video, we aim to introduce basic concepts dealing with counterpoint, which entails the various ways that different vocal and instrumental lines combine with each other. We'll begin by demonstrating how George and Paul often double each other, playing the same line with bass and guitar in octaves to reinforce various riffs. Then we'll take a look at some aspects of the Beatles' solo singing, and end by covering underlying principles of harmony produced in multiple vocal parts. When the bass line is doubled at the octave, it reinforces its strength, adds to its color, and may simplify the overall texture by reducing the number of independent parts, unless extra parts are added as overdubs. This doubling is a frequent sound in the early Beatles, and when it becomes even more marked in tracks like 1965's Day Tripper, which doubles two guitars with a bass, or in the distorted fuzz guitar added to the bass line of Think for Yourself from the same time frame, the Beatles are seen as progenitors of such hard rock guitar and bass doubling as produced by Cream and Led Zeppelin. Late Beatles songs, including Birthday and Dig a Pony, are based on this bass and guitar doubling texture. The first time we hear George and Paul doubling the bass line is in a December 1962 Star Club performance of Where Have You Been All My Life? They introduce the song with a riff alternating roots and fifths of each chord in a partly dotted rhythm that is maintained together through the first verse, while John provides backbeat chords on rhythm guitar. The riff goes like this: 3, 4. George will go his own way in the second verse, thickening the texture by adding a new guitar part. In other songs, bass and guitar begin with different materials, but come together in a riff that articulates the beginning or ending of a section of a song. When this riff occurs more than once in a song, always without voices, and it functions to alert the rest of the band and audience that a certain point has been reached, or maybe that the song has been reset to the beginning, I call this instrument-only alert a tattoo. This is what it sounds like in guitar and bass, and I'm going to sit right down and cry over you. I'll start just before the tattoo, which is doubled in octaves. 2, 3, 4. Here's a better known octave doubled tattoo from It Won't Be Long. 3, 4, 1. The tattoo need not be doubled by more than one part, but it often is. The instrumental break of From Me to You has an unusual texture, with one melodic line doubled in octaves on George's guitar alone, buttressed by Paul's bass below that, and further colored by John's harmonica. The bass line is an overdub and can be heard on top of a previously recorded bass figuration alternating roots and fifths in dotted rhythm. So in the break, we have two different bass lines plus two lines an octave apart on a single guitar. Here are just the overdub bass line and the lead guitar for the break. 1, 2, 3. In later live performances of From Me to You, Paul always doubles George's lead guitar and omits the functional root-bound bass line that he had first played on the record's basic track. On stage, Paul and George often cavort together at this point. As the final overdub for I Want to Hold Your Hand, George picks up the bass guitar to superimpose an octave doubling of one of Paul's bass riffs that embellishes a deceptive move from the 5 to a 6 chord in every verse. I'll play both Paul's bass line from the basic track and George's octave doubling in his superimposition. Before we address vocal counterpoint, I'd like to comment on the Beatles as solo singers. John and Paul led the voices most often, including on 20 of their 22 A-sides. But for tonal variety and also to appease the huge number of fans that followed each Beatle, George had 1 to 4 vocal numbers on each album, and Ringo had a lead vocal as well on all but 2. On stage, vocal assignments varied considerably to help conserve each member's throat, particularly in the early years when they would be on stage for hours. Paul had the highest vocal range. He loved to imitate Elvis Presley, Roy Orbison, and Little Richard. And in covering the last named, he shouted out Long Tall Sally, Ooh My Soul, and Kansas City completely on his own. He also sang tender ballads, often from films such as Till There Was You, on which he sounds more nervous than the others in the Decca audition, but much more confident when performing this on the second album. Paul could choose some schlocky stuff, like A Taste of Honey and the Honeymoon Song, also from films, but it should be noted that the latter song gave him an important idea about lyrics. In the Honeymoon Song, the line, "Skies are as bright as your eyes, the horizon is open," contains a great run of assonant vowels and consonants. Perhaps this idea rolled around in Paul's mind until 1967, when he came up with the line for She's Leaving Home, kitchen clutching her handkerchief. Can you hear the perfectly timed repeated sneezes in that line? Kitchen clutching her handkerchief? Although John's voice range was naturally not far below Paul's, he was comfortable singing the lowest vocal parts. He sang lots of raucous Chuck Berry, Too Much Monkey Business, I'm Talking About You, Rock and Roll Music, and Carol, and other R&B from Larry Williams, Slow Down and Bad Boy, from Arthur Alexander, Soldier of Love, Anna, and A Shot of Rhythm and Blues, and Little Willie John's Leave My Kitten Alone. In the clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg, John also sang rockabilly numbers such as Johnny Burnett's Lonesome Tears in My Eyes, and Carl Perkins' Matchbox and Honey Don't, both of which would later be given to Ringo to sing on records. George had a small vocal range and is remembered for sticking largely with guitar-oriented repertoire, lots of Carl Perkins, as with Glad All Over and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, and some Chuck Berry with Roll Over Beethoven. Ringo also possessed a small vocal range and a highly personal coloring, but loved to show it off in a set called Ringo Star Time while with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and continuing to have one vocal number in all Beatles shows. Known for such wild songs as Boys, Ringo's performance in the raver I Want to Be Your Man was such a favorite from the second album, it was reprised a year later in the film A Hard Day's Night. I'd now like to demonstrate some of the Beatles' early approaches to vocal counterpoint. We'll start with occasions on which John and Paul sang in unison, doubling the same line at the same pitch, in the same rhythm, and with the same words. This was typically done when both wanted to cover a song and neither one would give it up for the other, so they both ended up singing the same part together. You can hear and see the same results in a great film of the Beatles performing Some Other Guy at the Cavern in August 1962, and it's also how they performed A Shot of Rhythm and Blues and I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You. For their original songs, as in Misery, John and Paul will often start in unison, but break into harmony with Paul above John for the one word of the title refrain. Sometimes they create a terraced arrangement by which John and Paul sing the first bridge at the unison, but then in a repeated bridge, they'll adorn the same structure with a new descant part, which Paul adds a third above the pre-existing vocal line that John retains. So in From Me to You, John and Paul sing the same line in the first bridge in unison, like this. Da 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 da. But then in the second bridge, Paul adds a new line a third above the pre-existing line that John repeats, like this. Da 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 dum, da 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 dum. Having found a winning formula, the same approach adorns the second bridge in I Want to Hold Your Hand. For All My Loving, Paul double tracks a descant part for just the last verse. He duets with himself, singing both lines on the record. On stage, George is recruited to sing the main melody at this point with Paul above. Occasionally, as we demonstrated earlier with the tumbling strain in Love Me Do, John and Paul will sing in octaves, doubling the same part in different registers. This can also be heard in the introductory motto of I'll Get You on the repeated words, Oh Yeah, and in the bridges of There's a Place and It Won't Be Long. See if you can find those spots. When the Beatles sing different lines at the same time, it's almost always in parallel thirds, as we've just performed in the From Me to You bridge. This texture is largely modeled on the Everly Brothers, with Don singing lead and Phil the descant harmony part above him. Also as done by Carl and Jay Perkins. Sibling duets offer great vocal blendings because of all sorts of hereditary similarities. John and Paul sing in sweet parallel thirds in dozens of pre-1964 songs, especially in the three-hit A-sides of 1963. This sound is more characteristic of How Do You Do It than either of the 1962 recorded A-sides, but it's also written into the verses of Hello Little Girl, One After 909, There's a Place, and others. I'll sing both the vocal parts of Hello Little Girl. Da 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 da. But whereas John and Paul cover Mr. Moonlight in parallel thirds on stage in 1962, John will duet with himself, cutting both voices in the studio in late 1964, as if it's his answer to Paul's self-duet in All My Loving. Less often than with the descant relationship, Paul's upper line in a pair is sometimes the main melody, with John adding a lower harmony part. This vocal arrangement occurs mostly in cover songs, such as when Paul sings the main vocal part above John's in Your Feet's Too Big and Sure to Fall, or when George sings above John in So How Come and Devil in Her Heart. In Devil, note how the parallel thirds in the guitar part prepare the thirds in the vocal lines. Da 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 da. It's especially important to open your ears to how the early Beatles combined various lines, as it will put you in a much better position to recognize and appreciate the glorious vocal and instrumental counterpoint they would achieve in their middle period. Just as they would begin to discover all sorts of new instruments and ways of playing them, and hand in hand with the various approaches and innovations their team would make in engineering, the Beatles will explore a bewildering array of textures, constantly shifting through each later album.